Recognize the ranking member for an introduction of our next panelist.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm pleased to introduce Mr. Todd Morrow, the Executive Director for Island Transit, which provides safe, reliable, and accessible transportation services for more than 380,000 riders in Island County, Washington State each year. Todd's a seasoned leader in the transit industry with 23 years of experience, and I knew him before then as well. Throughout his career, he's worked to promote public transportation at the local, state, and federal level. In his role as Island Transit's Executive Director, Todd has helped the agency weather the pandemic, and he has secured funding for capital projects that will improve service for community members on the island. He's guided the agency through the interagency process by moving towards a zero-emission fleet, as well as implementing sustainable energy practices. He's also focused on increasing Island Transit's service, adding Sunday service for the first time in the agency's history. Morrow's leadership extends to various industry roles as well, including past presidency of the Washington State Transportation Association's Board of Directors, and he continues to be an integral part of the Bus Coalition, serving as the treasurer. I want to thank him for making the trip out and look forward to hearing his testimony. Thanks, Todd.
Thank you, Mr. Morrow. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Chair Crawford, Ranking Member Larsen, and committee members, thank you for this opportunity to discuss rural transit. I am Todd Morrow, Executive Director of Island Transit. I'm here representing the 1,200 members of CTAA, otherwise known as the Community Transportation Association of America, the majority of which are rural public transit systems. My public transit agency serves Island County, a rural county of 86,000 northwest of Seattle. Island County has the most visited state park in Washington and is the home of the Naval Air Station Whidbey Island. As a rural transit agency, we receive our federal funding through our state Department of Transportation. Island Transit has a $21 million annual budget, 63 buses, 136 employees, 16 bus routes, and an operating base on each of our 2 islands. We provide traditional, on-demand, paratransit, and van pool service. We carry approximately 7,500 passenger trips an average week. 13% of those are ADA paratransit trips for those receiving door-to-door service. Popular destinations include grocery stores, local hospital, Walmart, restaurants, schools, and the Washington State Ferry for Boeing and Microsoft workers. Just as in urban areas, people need access to those places. This is especially true for vulnerable Americans, older adults, persons with disabilities, and low-income individuals. Everything we do is about safely and equitably moving people. We are currently growing our service. Last June, we began bus service on Sundays for the first time. We are unique because we are zero fare. Our agency receives 70% of our operating revenue from voter-approved, locally collected sales tax. The recent increases in federal transit funding are making it possible for Island Transit to move 2 critical projects forward. One is our South Whidbey Transit Center project, which will create a safe place for off-street transfers. The Federal Transportation Administration awarded it $7.5 million. Like urban systems, rural systems need modern facilities. Competitive bus and bus facilities funding makes that possible. One challenge that occurs with facility building is transit, unlike highway projects, is required to complete the environmental process prior to purchasing the property. Our other major project is transitioning our fleet to zero-emission vehicles. We have 7 battery electric vehicles in our fleet already, solar panels on our 2 operating bases, and battery charging at our main operating base. Another challenge is the availability of vehicles. Our agency's current purchase of 9 more electric vans is in limbo because manufacturers have gone out of business. Vehicle prices, particularly for these small vehicles that rural systems depend on, have dramatically increased. This shortage also impacts large buses, particularly hydrogen fuel cell buses. There's just one Buy America compliant manufacturer of hydrogen buses. This year, we will be requesting federal funding to purchase 12 of those full-size hydrogen buses. Both Island Transit and CTAA support the Federal Transit Administration's recent prioritization of progress payments to bus manufacturers to help them with their cash flow challenges. We welcome strategies to increase access to new bus manufacturers while they become Buy America compliant. For rural systems, the fleet transition is challenging because advances in zero-emission technology have not successfully reached the smaller class of vehicles we use. Their battery range is low. Charging infrastructure, too, is just not as prevalent yet in rural America. The capacity of our local power grid and grid resiliency is also a concern. To address this, my agency has purchased acreage adjacent to our operating base, with the potential for siting a microgrid there for possible additional electricity. Recruitment is challenging for transit agencies as well. We see two places where the federal government could help us. One is to fast-track the certification of oral testing labs for our required drug and alcohol testing. CTAA requests members of this committee send a letter to HSS to urge them to finish this important work. Another area is the requirement for a commercial driver's license. We need an addition to the CDL passenger endorsement that is focused on bus driving and public transit. I'd like to end by introducing you to one of Island Transit's bus riders, James, a veteran turned veterans advocate. He said, "Island Transit gives people like me, a vet, a chance to go where I need to go and help others. Without Island Transit, I couldn't do what I do." I'd like to thank you for inviting me to speak to you today.
Thank you. Now recognize the gentleman from South Dakota to introduce our final witness.
Mr. Chairman, on one hand, it's sufficient to describe my friend Scott as a third-generation producer from Volga. That's important and noble work, so it's a good description. But on the other hand, it doesn't tell the whole story. The reality is Scott is among the very most trusted policy voices in South Dakota. And as I thought about why that is, it's because so many people in politics, they're dramatic and they're hyperbolic and their hair is always on fire. In typical Farm Bureau fashion, though, Scott Vanderwall is level, steady, deliberate, and wise. And so people in South Dakota have figured out that when Scott Vanderwall tells you something, you can take it to the bank. And I'm sure that will be the experience of this committee as well today. Thank you for being with us.
Thank the gentleman from South Dakota. And Mr. Vanderwall, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Good morning. I am Scott Vanderwall, a third-generation corn and soybean farmer and cattle feeder from East Central South Dakota. I'm president of the South Dakota Farm Bureau and vice president of American Farm Bureau Federation. And I'm pleased to offer this testimony today on behalf of the American Farm Bureau Federation and the nearly 6 million Farm Bureau member families across the United States. The long-term success of American agriculture relies upon a robust, safe, and dependable transportation network. My testimony today will outline several key issues affecting our nation's agriculture industry and transportation infrastructure. During the past few years, farmers in South Dakota have been under pressure from a variety of factors outside of our control, such as the pandemic, 3 consecutive years of drought, and the highly pathogenic avian influenza. Farmers were more frustrated than anyone at the supply chain delays we saw during the pandemic. We want the supply chains straightened out as soon as possible so we can get goods from our farms to America's pantries. That's why I'm grateful that Representative Johnson from South Dakota has introduced the Modernizing Operations for Vehicles and Emergencies Act, or the MOVE Act. This bill gives states more flexibility to waive federal weight limits in the interstate highway system in order to allow the states to respond to emergencies. This will help to resolve supply chain issues quickly and allow our food system to be more adaptable. The American Farm Bureau Federation continues to be supportive of the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act, or IIJA, that made essential investments to our nation's infrastructure. These investments will continue to give farmers and ranchers a leg up on competitors in the world market. This last year, the U.S. became a net importer of food for the first time in many of our lifetimes. So new investments are timely. This is a huge concern for us as we work very hard every day to make sure that the United States is not dependent upon other countries for our food supply. Food security is a huge part of national security, and we take that very, very seriously. Farmers and ranchers do not work remotely, but our products reach markets well beyond our farm gates. Nearly everything we do involves physical items, whether it's crop inputs, feed, livestock, grains, or other produce that we grow. These all have to be moved physically from or to markets around the world or the United States. While highways play a vital role in transporting goods across the country, we must also recognize the importance of our rail and inland waterway infrastructure. In most cases, transporting goods via waterways can be more cost-effective than traditional road transport. The National Highway Trust Fund serves as the backbone of our transportation infrastructure, providing crucial funding for maintenance and improvement of our roads and bridges. Farm Bureau supports increasing Federal Highway Trust Fund fees to reflect improvements in fuel economy and increased inflation. We also support revenue collection efforts to those users whose vehicles do not contribute to the Federal Highway Fund, such as electric vehicles. I'm hopeful that this committee will work with the American Farm Bureau Federation to prioritize long-term, sustainable funding solutions for the National Highway Trust Fund. Electronic logging devices, or ELDs, play a crucial role in ensuring the safety and efficiency of our nation's transportation system. However, certain exemptions of these devices are necessary to accommodate the unique needs of the agricultural community. We aren't hauling widgets that can sit in a truck bed for 10 hours. We're hauling live animals, and each stop along the way poses hazards to the livestock. The IIJA provided an exemption for livestock and insect haulers from hours of service regulations within a 150-mile air radius of their final destination. We are thankful that Congress continues to recognize that need, and we ask for continued support on that. In conclusion, I urge this committee to consider the perspectives and priorities of the agricultural community as you work to address the challenges that face our nation's transportation infrastructure. By working together to prioritize long-term investment, maintain necessary exemptions, and promote biofuel production, we can ensure a brighter, more sustainable future. Thank you so much for the opportunity to testify before you today, and I'll look forward to your questions.
Thank you, sir. I thank all the witnesses for being here today. Thank you for your testimony. Now turn to member questions. I recognize myself. I'd like to raise an issue that I have significant concerns with, which is the Federal Highway Administration's final rule to create a greenhouse gas performance measure, forcing state departments of transportation and metropolitan planning organizations to set declining targets for carbon dioxide emissions stemming from transportation on the national highway system. This policy was considered and rejected as part of negotiations of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Despite that fact, the Biden administration continues to march forward with their proposal. The full committee and this subcommittee have previously heard concerns from other stakeholders regarding this rule. Specifically, folks have raised concerns about how this rule will impact the ability of states to select their own projects and what that would mean to rural communities. As I mentioned in my opening statement, these are areas where a subway system or bike lanes just simply don't make sense, and they won't help move people or goods within or from our rural areas. So I'd like to start with Mr. Grediman. Do you share those concerns?
Yes, great question, Chairman. Absolutely. You know, because the greenhouse gas performance measures apply a one-size-fits-all to both rural and urban communities, it just doesn't make sense for certain communities to have bike lanes, to have subways, to have heavy transit in rural Iowa, rural Arkansas, western Nebraska. These places don't need that type of service. And when you start influencing state officials on how they can spend their revenue, it leads to me, it just seems like a recipe for disaster. And reducing greenhouse gas is important, but it needs to be done in a fiscally sensible way. They'll end up spending money on projects that are not necessary and don't provide any economic benefit. And no, I don't think it benefits rural America at all.
Thank you. Mr. Vanderwall, you addressed this in your written testimony. You want to expand on that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, we are very concerned about that process because it does complicate the process. For a small state like South Dakota, we don't have the resources in a lot of cases, and frankly, not the need for some of these transportation methods. Like you mentioned, subways. We don't have any subways in South Dakota. Electric vehicles is another one that's a real challenge for us because it can be 25 degrees below zero in the wintertime. And as we saw with Chicago during the cold snap this winter, they don't work well in that circumstance. So we believe it's not fair to states that have fewer resources, and we need flexibility among the states. Like the previous speaker said, one size doesn't fit all.
Got it. Mr. Gretaman, in your testimony, you discussed the importance of having one federal standard for companies engaged in interstate commerce as it relates to meal and rest break provisions. Can you elaborate on that and why there's currently a patchwork of state provisions and how that's problematic?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, one aspect of our company's mission is maintaining operational simplicity. And not only would this create operational inefficiencies for our company, it creates operational inefficiencies for every single company that operates in interstate commerce. How would the DOT hours of service rules apply? Which state regulations would supersede? You know, we have motor coaches that depart Sioux Falls, South Dakota, pick up a group in northwest Iowa, the driver from South Dakota, switch drivers in Illinois or Missouri by St. Louis, switch to another driver. Which sets of rules would apply? We're going to drive through 6 states. We're going to use drivers from multiple states. We have an origin, we have a destination. Which state rules will apply? You know, cross-country travel will be completely disrupted. How will electronic logging devices accommodate the different state changes? Right now, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations, they work. We have a uniform safety scheme that works great for the United States travel, and having a patchwork of different state provisions would just be an utter failure in progress of moving goods, services, and people across the United States.
Thank you. The Clean Freight Coalition just this week announced the results of a study which found $1 trillion in investments could be required to meet goals set by states and federal government to reduce emissions from and electrify the trucking sector. Mr. Vanderwall, our ag sector, like many others, relies on trucking to deliver goods to market. American families are dependent on those products. I have some concerns about forcing a massive shift to EVs, and particularly as it applies to trucks. A trucker hauling cattle across Arkansas doesn't have the hours to spend waiting for their truck to charge. Your thoughts on that in just a few seconds?
Yes, we would be concerned about that. We feel that if the administration wants to reduce the carbon footprint, we certainly have something to contribute through biofuels and renewable fuels that we can contribute. You're correct. We can't have livestock trucks sitting along the side of the road, especially in hot conditions. So it's very, very much a concern for us.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Ranking Member Norton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a question for Mr. Coles. Can you share your concerns about the bill and the effects that allowing heavier trucks would have on safety and infrastructure, particularly on bridges?
We work closely with the Farm Bureau in our state, and we're going to take just a little bit different position than the Farm Bureau during this hearing. So NATAT is opposed to extra weights on the roads. From an engineering aspect, it creates more damage, especially to bridges. Bridges don't care about axles, it's all about weight. And then from a safety standpoint, for the few states that we do have enough quality data from, the safety aspects are problematic as well because the crash amounts increase. So we're very concerned about any increased weights beyond the current standards that are there right now.
Thank you. Mr. Morrow, your testimony notes that over 15% of people in Island County have a disability. Transit is often a lifeline for people with disabilities. Can you share any strategies or success stories from Island Transit's work serving those in your community with disabilities?
Well, thank you very much, Ranking Member Holmes-Norton. Appreciate the question. And yes, as you know, transit is critical to supporting access to opportunities for all Americans, especially those who are dependent on it. and that includes people with disabilities. And one of the things that we've done in order to make more access to opportunities available is increase our service and add service. As you heard, we added Sunday service for the first time in our history, which means that now people who are transit dependent or with disabilities and use us can now access and do whatever they want on Sundays where our service goes. And one really interesting story about that was a gentleman named Lucas, one of our bus riders, a wonderful young man, who was obviously thrilled that we would add Sunday service because it opened up opportunities for him. He organizes his life around our bus service so that he can see his friends and go to work and do all those things. When he met me the first week after I was at Island Transit, he saw me standing at the bus stop looking like I am today, and I think he was pretty suspicious, who's this guy getting on there, and he knew right away I was the new executive director. And he treated me like the President of the United States because what Island Transit does for him on a daily basis so very much improves his life. Thank you.
Mr. Morrow, what can Congress do to help ensure transit agencies can purchase the vehicles they need?
Well, thank you for that question. You're already doing it with the investments, for instance, the strong and increased investments in the bus and bus facilities program has made a substantial difference. Obviously, a bus operator like myself will say there's always room to do more. I think you all know that there was maybe $8 billion in requests in the last round for bus and bus facilities funding, and available was about $1.7 billion, something like that. My agency benefited from that, and I thank Ranking Member Larsen for that, for the FTA grant that we received. But also supporting things like the progress payments that the FTA is working on that will help manufacturers so that they can receive payment for the vehicles as they're produced. That will help them. Investing in technology. One of the real challenges in the rural transit industry for us in the CTAA world is that not all of those improvements have made it to the small bus market yet. And so we really need to see longer battery ranges, other options in the small vehicle market. And then, as I mentioned before, and this is, I know, something that some of you are working on, is an on-ramp for the manufacturers who are in the process of coming to the United States, who have good vehicles that we could use today. We need somehow to have access to those vehicles while they're working through the Buy America process. It's all those sorts of things in combination. And then also remember, it's different depending on whether small vehicles and large vehicles. There's no one-size-fits-all response. Thank you.
And I yield back.
The gentlelady yields. Gentleman from South Dakota, Mr. Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Vander Wal, ag shippers have dealt with a lot in recent years, high path, drought, COVID. Talk to us about the difficulties they've faced when dealing with those challenges and the emergency truck weight waivers.
Well, thank you, Representative, for that question. That's a big deal for South Dakota and frankly, most of the states. And I guess I would use an example of the Texas drought about 3 years ago. South Dakota was having a good year. We had lots of hay, and we had lots of ranchers wanting to donate hay to the ranchers in Texas. And logistically, it got to be a problem because they had to get exemptions from governors across all the states, all the way from South Dakota to Texas, and that got to be quite a process. But what the situation is you want to do something like that as economically inexpensively as you can. And when you have people donating hay, and in some cases we had people donating their at least some of the truck miles, the trip permits and all the things that go along with going through those states and the different regulations get to be a problem. So our members put in policy a request to streamline the process to make that happen more economically.
Yeah, and you can just imagine all kinds of scenarios, emergency scenarios where some additional flexibility and streamlining that flexibility could be useful. Give us some other ideas, examples of where ag shippers, or really the ag industry generally, would want a little more flexibility.
Well, I would start out by answering that by saying livestock can't wait for feed in disaster situations. We've had it in South Dakota too, floods, snowstorms, all kinds of things. We've had several cases in the past where the governor has waived the height and weight limits for trucks hauling hay certain times of the day or extended the hours. Those are all times when livestock in particular need taken care of, and they can't wait, like I said.
So as we look to, I mean, there's a 150-mile exemption for ag truck drivers. They can get around the hours of service, or the hours of service don't apply to them. In general, is that working pretty well? Are there any reforms needed to the system?
Yes, it certainly has helped because it gives them some flexibility. And flexibility is what we really need. When we talk about this whole situation, that's really the key. And I'll use an example of trucks that go out to western South Dakota or Montana to pick up feeder cattle. A lot of times they have to go out in the pastures, and the rancher will often have them rounded up in the corrals, and sometimes they don't. So the trucker can arrive, and it might take 20 minutes to load the load, or it could take 2 hours. And at that point, they might know that they're going to be out of hours before they get where they're going. And a concern that we would have there is if that happens, a rancher may not be able to sell his cattle that have to go that far away. And maybe that's the best bidder for his cattle, but he could be prevented from selling for the best price in that circumstance.
Yeah, not everybody might understand how much more difficult cattle can be to wrangle than a pallet of iPhones. They have their own minds, and they don't always take orders very well, as you know better than I do. Let's talk a little bit about the global supply chain and shipping. During COVID, the West Coast ports were pretty locked up for quite a little while. That had a pretty big impact on beans, which I know, along with corn and cattle, you produce. And then also with the Red Sea. I mean, is Farm Bureau concerned about, and have we seen much disruption, particularly the corn and bean folks, because of the Red Sea issue?
Yes, we have seen some disruptions, and obviously we're in a worldwide economy when it comes to corn and beans and a lot of these commodities. And it affects the markets because the markets get jittery about certain things like that. They don't like uncertainty. They don't like disruptions. And whether or not the products that we raise in South Dakota are going someplace where they have to go through the Black Sea, that doesn't really matter, but it's the disruptions in the market. And so we try to look for other markets or expanded markets around the world, but at this point, we haven't been able to do that either. So it is a problem, and we're concerned about it going forward.
So, Mr. Chairman, I would close by just trying to underline a couple of things that Mr. Vanderwall talked about, things that we can take back into our work. Number one, some additional flexibility for America's growers. I mean, our farmers and ranchers, they'll do better if they have the flexibility they need to get these products, get this food to market. And then also the importance of developing new markets abroad. In America, we ship out a heck of a lot of corn, beans, beef, vegetables, dairy, and other things. People are hungry for our food. Let's make it easier for them to get it. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Ranking Member Larsen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Morrow, Todd, thanks for coming, helping us out on short notice. Appreciate that. And I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about Island County or Island Transit Service. I think it might have been kind of glossed over quickly. Island Transit, by its virtue of its name, it's an island. In fact, it's two islands, not just one island. It's two separate islands, unconnected by a bridge. You have to go around into other counties to get the other island. So you have some unique challenges, but you're trying to update service, expand service, extend hours, and of course you move to Sunday. From a rural transit perspective, what are the challenges you're facing doing that?
Yeah, thank you very much, Congressman. One of the main challenges right now, and I think it exists in pretty much every industry, of course, is having the workforce available to do the things that are needed. In our case, we just started another class of driver trainees. That's great, but we still need more. And in order to complete our transition, as that you alluded to what we call Island Transit Maximized, to expand service, to really meet all the needs throughout the day, we need to add a couple of hours to the end of the day. And that's the last thing that we need to do. And it's going to take us probably about 7 to 10 more drivers in order to do that. So it's going to be several months off. We had hoped to do it last year. So that is always challenging. Operating costs are definitely always higher in rural environments, and that's something that all of us that provide transit across America, and particularly rural situations, know. But just because we're in a rural environment doesn't mean that those people deserve any less the services that all Americans enjoy.
So on extending hours to the end of the day, why is that so important?
Well, we have essential workers, for instance, that rely on transit because their transportation costs are so high. Transit allows them to save money, and these are the people that work, for instance, at Walmart, one of our busiest commercial entities on the island that serves the people that are there. Their hours are till 11 o'clock at night, and so those workers that work those shifts are not currently able to use us because we don't have those hours. That's what our goal is, to add those hours so that we can support those workers.
And then do you have specific service? You mentioned Naval Air Station Whidbey Island, which is I should note, the home of half of the P-8 fleet and all of the Growler fleet, the electronic attack aircraft. So you're welcome, America. Do you have any specific service for NAS Whidbey Island?
Yes, thank you for asking. We actually have on-demand direct service where individuals who are properly credentialed, including servicemen and women as well as civilians that are there, we take them from their neighborhoods directly on base, and the wonderful thing about it is it avoids the congestion at the gate and leading up to the gate, and it saves them money. Many of them are a single car household, and so this frees up the car to be used by the spouse that's not working there.
You mentioned a challenge, or maybe you didn't see it as a challenge, but the service you provide for folks who are disabled or homebound or otherwise, about 13% of your ridership, is that right?
Yep, exactly. Yep. 13% of our service is paratransit service. Obviously, that's expensive because you're providing a door-to-door service. So what we try to do is batch together as many trips as possible. There's software that we use. This is something rural transportation providers have been doing forever, is figuring out ways to efficiently transport people where they need to go. But it is more expensive. We've combined it now with our on-demand service in other areas so that we can do all of those things together more efficiently.
Can you, how does that compare to, say, your neighboring transit agencies?
Well, on-demand service is something that's starting to be seen more and more across the country. We've just started it. There are some that still do not have it. And then if you're getting to the point of how do we connect up with other systems, we have arrangements and we do connect both our paratransit and our fixed route scheduled service so that people can make those connections. However, if you're a veteran and you need to go to Veteran Affairs or medical services, that can be harder in a rural area like ours because there are no direct bus routes off the island to take people. So there are actually social service agencies that provide that service with our help. We provide them the van, the training, we maintain that van so they can do that.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks for making the trip out, and hopefully we'll see you at home.
Thank you.
Back.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Mann.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, thanks for having this hearing, to really zone in on the needs of our rural communities. So I represent the 1st District of Kansas, which is 60 counties in the mostly central and western part of the state. I'm from a rural community. My hometown, 800 people. My driver's ed coach was also my basketball coach, which if you're from a rural community, you understand that. And he used to load us up when we drive 60 miles to the big city of Hayes because there are stoplights in Hayes and there's no stoplight in our county as we were learning how to drive. Our family has a farm and a feed yard, and I remember that my dad and brother still operate, but middle of the night, cattle truck rolls in, you unload them. Those cattle may have been on the road from Kentucky, Tennessee, Texas, Florida, incredibly important. And repeatedly, the driver's number one priority was safety and also caring for those animals, and then they would put their own needs last because that's just the makeup of that industry. And Mr. Vanderwall, a handful of questions for you, and this continues to come up, this errors of service operation or exemption, and it keeps coming up this morning because it is so incredibly important to the industry. So would you just further expand upon the importance of the exemption, but also possible ramifications, or what are the effects if we do not continue this exemption in the future?
Well, thank you for that question. It all comes down to flexibility, again, like I said before. I'll use the example of loading cattle in Montana. You know, that can vary by a couple of hours. And if it's so important, especially in hot times when you're hauling livestock, you have to keep moving to make sure that the air moves through the trailer to keep livestock cool. And they can't just be sitting along the edge of the road. So, like I said earlier, that may limit a person's ability to sell where he wants to sell, or it could just be a situation where we're not treating the livestock right, and that's not what we're after at all. It's, you know, first is safety of the people driving the truck and the vehicles around it, but also animal welfare.
That's exactly right. What could Congress do to improve upon the exemption, and should we consider codifying it or making it permanent? You know, we forget, you know, we have to make an exemption every year. I would be for just making this flexibility permanent, but what are your thoughts on that issue?
Well, first of all, we very much appreciate the exemption because it has solved some problems and given us flexibility. But it would be nice to have it permanent because we always have to have our antennas up to make sure we are out there advocating to get that renewed again.
Yeah, and it just provides more uncertainty to an industry that is plagued with uncertainty, given market conditions and all the travails of trying to raise and care for, feed, and eventually produce livestock to produce meat. Last question, how can Congress ensure that our rural infrastructure is prioritized at a time when it seems like many times the administration overlooks rural America? In your view, Mr. Vander Waal, what is administration and what ought we be doing to focus more on the rural communities all across our country from a transportation standpoint?
Well, that's a great question. I think it really comes down to recognize the importance of rural America in producing our food for our country and for the world, and also energy and fiber. I always say when I give a speech, food security is national security. And as long as we can feed ourselves, no matter what happens around the world, we'll be okay. But if we get to the point where we have to depend on other countries for our food supply, that's a serious problem.
I wholeheartedly agree. Mr. Chairman, thank you again for having this hearing. Thank you all for being here, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. Ms. Foshee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for your testimonies. In my district, North Carolina's 4th, the Research Triangle Park is growing thanks to investments in world-class research centers and businesses big and small. But as it grows, the lack of affordable housing has pushed those who work in the Triangle to move farther and farther out into the more rural areas. That's why it has become more important for regional transportation to reach rural areas like those in Granville, Person, and Orange counties, for example. Mr. Morrow, how can we better mitigate traffic on the major local roadways to ease access for those who commute long distances daily?
Thank you very much for that question. Invest more in transit, because as Island Transit does, we have services that run from one of our islands into another county just for that exact reason. Every time you have more transit, more people can use it, and that takes cars off those roads. And in many cases, those commutes are pretty awful, I'm imagining, in your district. And it's a far better way to ride comfortably in a bus and not have to worry about that congestion. And you're benefiting all the other users of that highway as well, because you're actually increasing the carrying capacity of those roadways without spending millions of dollars to add more lanes, by instead putting people who choose to on buses. So it's a win-win for everybody. We have a great relationship with our State Department of Transportation in Washington State. They very much support the work of transit because they know the more that people use transit, it increases the capacity of those facilities and lessens the burden on them to expand and increase them at even higher rates. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. I also have a concern about the difficulties that small rural municipalities face in applying for grant funding, like a lack of time, staff, and experience. What resources or educational systems could a congressional office provide to these municipalities to better equip them to apply and compete for funding with larger cities? And this question goes to both Mr. Morrow and Mr. Colas.
The challenge for local, small communities is real. You're having a community of a couple of hundred people, a couple of thousand people that don't have the staff or the financial resources to hire out for grant writers. And they're competing with, in some of these grants, communities that are hundreds of thousands of people. So it's really a David and Goliath situation. From a strategy standpoint, what could we do in a congressional office? Yes, I think it's about education, but some of these grants are so complex to write that education of some of our local officials who are salt of the earth people, but they just don't operate in that arena, might work in some cases, but more likely the better strategy is to actually provide some funding to hire grant writers so that those folks that do not have the resources to even buy a ticket to the ballpark can get a ticket to the ballpark. Absent doing that with these grants, and we've moved to a very grant-oriented system, you're just going to leave them out of the option to apply and obtain those grants.
So I was just going to add ditto, but also funding the various national programs that help create the capacity for people to learn how to write those grants. CTAA, for instance, has an annual conference where people can come and learn how to do that. But probably the most important thing that you and your office can directly do is just let the agencies know when these grant opportunities come, and that will really help them. In our case, at my agency, our grant writer also serves as the clerk of the board and my assistant. So we all wear lots of hats, and so any help that you and your staff can provide is always greatly wanted. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields. Mr. Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses being here today. Mr. Gretaman, as you know, New York City is in the process of finalizing details related to the Central Business District tolling program, a first of its kind, incredibly destructive congestion pricing scheme that unfairly hurts New Jerseyans. Under the plan, this program will impose significant tolling costs on daily commuters and charge between $24 and $36 per bus to companies that regularly bring visitors into the city. This will most surely include charter bus routes for school field trips into New York City. Each year, hundreds of school field trips from my district in New Jersey travel to the city to visit various museums and landmarks. How do you think this congestion pricing plan will impact the price of a school field trip, and how will it affect ABA members operating these routes?
Yes, thank you for the question, Mr. Keene. When you think about the origin of the congestion pricing, it is to reduce congestion in the Central Business District. And whether that congestion is reduced by a private motor coach, private bus, or a publicly funded city bus, a government contracted commuter bus, the bus is inherently reducing congestion, whether it's private or public. The fact that private buses are having to pay the tax and public buses are not doesn't make sense. At the end of the day, it's not necessarily about reducing congestion. It feels more like a tax. And it does affect the school kids that are going to New York City to sightsee and spend money. It does affect the seniors that are going to see a play and spend money at a restaurant. And at the end of the day, to me, to the ABA, it appears more like it is just another tax that is only being applied to private operators, whether you're riding in a privately owned bus or a government-owned bus.
Mr. Gretaman, I also understand that the MTA has announced plans to exempt personal vehicles of people who have disabilities from their congestion pricing scheme, as well as city-run paratransit vehicles, which is commendable. Given the role and capabilities of your members' buses, how could this impact people who have disabilities from areas like my district who might want to visit New York, but may not want or be able to drive?
Yeah, I believe that it will positively affect these people. There's no reason why a private operator won't be able to transport someone with disabilities. Most of the private motor coaches are equipped with ADA lifts, which will accommodate that. But at the end of the day, it still boils down to why are certain exemptions out there for private versus government buses?
So the cost will go up.
The cost will go up. The cost will go up for the riders. The cost will go up for the bus companies. And again, it's just another tax that it's not necessarily about reducing congestion. It seems to be a tax.
And then on a different issue, you've referenced in your testimony the difficulties the intercity bus operators have in accessing train stations and other local transit centers to drop off or pick up passengers. Can you expand on how these problems affect ABA members and specifically their passengers?
Yeah, absolutely. So when a private operator is not allowed to use a publicly funded transit center for pickups and drop-offs, it creates a bottleneck in the national transportation system as far as making meaningful connections for passengers. A lot of times, people that are riding intercity buses may not have the means to connect to the intercity bus carrier without going through a transit, without riding the bus, without riding a city bus to get to the intercity bus. If the intercity bus station, in some scenarios, is in a non-desirable or it's in an industrial area where there's poor access, it makes riding intercity buses less attractive and less convenient, and what it ends up doing is not allowing certain members of the traveling public to be able to get to the bus station to get to where they need to go.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and thank you to the witnesses for your testimony today. I've filed some legislation back in January, the Stronger Communities Through Better Transit Act. It has 104 co-sponsors, and what it would do would be to create a grant program, $80 billion over 4 years, $20 billion a year to support operational costs as opposed to capital costs for transit in underserved and unserved urban and rural communities. And with respect to rural communities, it would increase the federal share for operating costs to 80%, which would be something very important to extend transit to rural communities, rural people living in rural communities. Is that legislation something that you gentlemen can support?
Well, Todd Morrow from Island Transit. We are part of a broader organization, CTAA, who can give you more information about that, of course. But what I can tell you from our agency perspective, investment in transit is good and important, so thank you for that. I can also say that when it comes to operational funding, it's critical that we know that that operational funding will continue. So it can't be a time-limited bill, because if that's the case, it's hard for a transit provider, whether for-profit or nonprofit or a governmental agency, to plan. If you provide service and then the money runs out, you have to cut the service. and there's nothing more horrible in our world than having to reduce service. So for us, we would always want something to have promise of continued payment. We welcome any investment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Johnson, would private operators, private transit operators be eligible for these grants?
Well, I would think that contracts with public agencies to provide transit to underserved areas would be covered. I'd have to go back and check it. If it's not, it should be.
Absolutely, I agree, and it would be great, and I think that 80% level is an appropriate amount and would be great for both private and public entities.
Yeah, it doesn't take a great big bus to go into a small city or small community and pick up 2 or 3 people. It can be a van, ideally, or it could even be some other vehicle. But just a way of getting people in rural areas to the pharmacy, to the doctor's office, to school, to the community college, or to visit a sick relative. Those things are important to people who live in urban areas and people who live in rural areas. Mr. Coles, you have anything to say about it? And Mr. Vanderwall?
Well, thank you. I apologize, I don't know the details of the bill, but from a general standpoint, when there's a need in a rural community, which all of South Dakota is, it's usually appreciated. Having said that, we always have to watch out for what the strings that might be attached are. So, I'm not sure what our policy would be on that, so I'll have to leave it with that. Thank you.
And no strings attached.